So today let's start with Bourdieu's work. And since you guys have no questions, no comments, no doubts regarding Levi-Strauss, so we can move on to the next reading from your course. We will do the Frankfurt School critical theory in the last, and also because then I hope by that time college would be open. Okay, so you have had a brief reading on Bourdieu, maybe in your stratification paper on cultural and social reproduction. In this course, you have a writing on Bourdieu, which is on his the theory of practice. So there is a text written by him, which is called as the logic of practice. I think that's the discussion, and the aim here is that as part of your post classical sociological thinking, you are familiarized with the new attempts to bring in a new model on theory. So we have many such writers who try to combine and bridge the gap between agency and structure, which has been the classical theoretical dilemma for us. And in this case, Bourdieu becomes important because his work was to deal with the questions in a different manner and come up with his own unique vocabularies, theoretical concepts, and perspective. So, some people would call Bourdieu as a philosopher, some would call him as a structuralist, some would call him as an anthropologist, and there are reasons for this because his writings is like a critique, not just the theoretical critique or a critique of a particular theory, but the way sociology is done, the way social sciences are done. He was critical of this whole exercise, and not just to reject it, but also to bring up a new framework or to address the limitations of social theory in the post-war period. I consider Pierre Bourdieu to be my favorite sociologist, favorite in the sense that he had raised many questions related to theory, related to practice, related to the politics and pedagogy about it. And he came up with some models, although they have their own limitations, but he was trying to update, so to speak, the sociology from his uh, limitations and vulnerabilities of the classical thinking. Yeah, so he, on the one hand, he attacked structuralism of the kind that we read in Levi Strauss, and particularly he was attacking vehemently the structuralism of Louis Althusser's, who was a structural Marxist, and he was also kind of attacking the micro sociological approaches like phenomenology and ethnomethodology. In his writings, you will constantly find a dialogue between structuralism and phenomenology. So he was saying that he was trying to bring up a new idea that sociology cannot be solely based on subjectivity. So where is the sociologist there in the whole description about the subjectivity? And also his critique of postmodernist approach. And according to him, postmodernism is unscientific or relativist, and it doesn't tell us anything about the social world, and it is merely a gamut of words, terms, vocabularies, and so on. So, on the one hand, Bourdieu attacked philosophy for its disdain and disinterest of empirical sociology. On the other hand, he was critiquing economics for its too much obsession with rational action, and he also critiqued his own discipline, which is sociology, which was trying to be too much objectivist. So he was critiquing survey methods, and people attribute that Bourdieu brought in a new approach combining the objectivism and the subjectivism, and this approach is called MCP or MCM, which is called multiple correspondence method. So where he would create graphical imagery of interests and locations, and based on his field theory he will try to map where are things coming from. So as an intellectual also he had a very different take on many issues of, for example, revolution, on state, on academia. And there is a particular book, if you are interested, after the discussion, after the uh, basic description of his method and his personality, we can have a brief engagement with his wonderful text called Pascalian Meditations, right? And there are many works written on him, and those are interpretations. Those are different interpretations from certain vantage points. So we cannot take it as we should not take it as the only one interpretations of his theories and his perspectives. So let's engage with Bourdieu, and the text which is assigned to us is called The Logic of Practice, and there is a brief passage from his text called Outline of a Theory of Practice, which is assigned to us in this course. Before we go on there, uh, we'll try to understand a little bit of his biographical context, his intellectual context, and where he was coming from, why he was understanding certain concepts in a certain manner, why he was constantly focusing on doing empirical research but not losing at the sight of theory, right? So Bourdieu was born in 1913, 1930. So in 1930 he was born in a village in southwestern France, and he he died of cancer in 2002, right after he got retired from his position as chair of sociology from College de France. And he came from a rural context. So his grandfather was a sharecropper. He was raised up in a rural context. He also attended École Normale Supérieure Institute in Paris during his 1940s and 50s, where he got his early training in philosophy. And École Normale Supérieure is supposed to be the most prestigious intellectual institution of France in those days. So even Durkheim went to this place. Even Foucault got his education from this place. So it is supposed to be the very important center for academic engagement and discussion. Uh, Bourdieu then also moved to social sciences in the early 1950s after his training in philosophy. Because of the state and societal conditions, he had to go for military services. That was the norm in many places, and he had to visit a place called Algeria. And this is where he got in touch with anthropological writings. So he was assigned to be conducting researches in villages in colonial Algeria in those days, in 1950-55. And there he understood the people's lives there, how do natives live there, and what is the position of his own country, France. And he undertook field work. He was trying to understand the local agrarian economy there, and from there he developed many of the critiques of classical anthropological theory about time, about space, about exchange. He had very much interested, like he got this fascination with the studying the exchange practices, and thereby he got in touch with the writings of Marcel Mauss, yeah, and then Levi Strauss. So that is the linkages with classical writings and classical framework. And there are one of the most two cited books which are quite popular. First is that the text we are reading, Outline of a Theory of Practice, and second is called Distinction, where he talks about uh, social class and its relation to judgment, to aesthetics, and some people would call it an ethnography of French society. Then he also got into studying the education system, and he came up with a book called Reproduction in Education, Culture and Society. And he came up with a critique of the education system in his text called Homo Academicus. Uh, he was not comfortable with the existing ways in doing research, and that is how he started conducting his own research and what he calls reflexive sociology. Some people would call it participant objectivation, and he defines how ways through which we can control or make a balance between subjectivity and objectivity in research. And his collaborator and his colleague Luc Boltanski, uh, and later on he also uh, worked with another French scholar whose name is Louis. Uh, his name is Louis Wacant. So Wacant has continued to work on Bourdieu's approaches. He recently came up with a text on neoliberalism and state. So Louis Wacant is now popularly known as the Bourdieusian sociologist, and both of them together have written certain books. Their approach is called social analysis, right? So they were trying to bring up a new model to do social sociology. So they said that as psychology has psychoanalysis, sociology should have social analysis, and there has to be a new different model to conduct research. And he was very critical of the ways in which concepts become important, and concepts then block the sociologist's ways of understanding things. So he was, in that sense, critical of already existing approaches. He he was studying power structure in France, so he was studying elites. Then he came up with his own concept from. He says that we need to shift from power elite to fields of power, which is a new concept of field and habitus, right? So there are two poles through which you can understand how scholars engage with their immediate atmosphere, social and cultural and political atmosphere, and they remain in terms of the position that they have been working on. So for example, people place Bourdieu and Foucault in one context in terms of their engagement with politics. Similarly, people engage Bourdieu with Goffman in terms of their engagement to sociological model. Erving Goffman, that we studied earlier, his theory of presentation of self in everyday life, how do we go for impression management, so on. So while Goffman was working in American context, and he was there, he also taught later on at University of Berkeley, uh, University of California, and Bourdieu remained in France. He used continued to work in College de France, and later on it also taught in uh, Central European University. And among other contemporaries of Bourdieu, there is another scholar and well-known sociologist. His name is Raymond Era. I am not sure whether you have heard his name. Raymond Era was another French sociologist who worked on power, again, who worked on elites, authority structures, and so that is the brief context. Related to his formal education, after finishing his schooling in France uh, and his initial training as a in terms of philosophical writings, he got in he got fascinated with this discipline of ethnography and ethnology. So he studied a lot about language. He studied in detail different debates in the field of ethnography about how to conduct field work, or how to conduct field studies and field researches. And then he was constantly going forth back to his training as a philosopher, and there he got in touch with many writings of scientists, so philosophers of science basically. So how does science happen, how do we engage with science, right? So that is where he developed his orientation of sociology as a scientific discipline. So, in spite of his critique of science, he seems to be speaking and constantly contributing to a modern objectivist and subjectivist simultaneously model of sociology. And he says that following Marx, he was very much motivated by Marx to always focus on what are the tensions, conflicts, and dynamics in society. So, as Lev Strauss and later on Louis Althusser said that for Marx, society is divided in terms of two classes. So there's a constant conflict and struggle between haves and have-nots. Similarly, they said that in philosophy also there is a struggle between uh, materialism and idealism. So some people continue to work on these binaries, and Bourdieu was the one who said these are false dichotomies. So this idea of objective, subjective, theory, practice, it doesn't make sense actually. So that is how he began his engagement with the new theoretical model, and that's why this notion of practice is important for it. So he says that in practice your theory and empirical combine together, there is no difference, you cannot separate the both, right? So this dualism has to be overcome and we need to transcend it. That is how he take that theory of practice is supposed to do this. And he was very much influenced by Ludwig Wittgenstein, who was a sociologist and philosopher who talked about language, how do we understand reality, how do we understand social life, and so on. So Bourdieu got draw on his idea of game, and Bourdieu constantly refers to sociology as a game, as a sports, and that's how he says that we need to focus on the strategies that the people use in their everyday life, and that is how he conceptualizes habitus, right? So habitus means that how do people act bodily, and though not through their conscious knowledge or conscious behavior thinking, but we are trained by society's conditioning of our own ways of doing things. So there is a particular way within which we approach our ways of thinking, sitting, behaving, acting, all that is shaped by the field which where we are located, and field shapes the habitus. But through our all the activities that we engage in through habitus, the field is also constantly supplemented, kind of contributed to by the habitus. So there is a dialectic relation between field and habitus, and that's how he tries to overcome this binary of uh, agency and structure. So he was combining, in that sense, Marx and Durkheim on the one hand, and Weber on the other hand. But he said that we can understand the social world, the people, the knowledge that people have about their own life, but not through the conscious subjective knowledge. He was constantly trying to avoid the subjective aspect of it. And if you go back to our previous classes, you can link it with the way George Herbert Mead was also avoiding any focus on subjective conscious thinking and experience as central to sociological analysis. So, have a look at the text. If you have some questions, we can return back to it, and then we'll begin with Bourdieu's concept of practice.